I am going to introduce now our speaker. This is Dr. Craig Miller, and getting my notes out. Dr. Miller is a vascular surgeon educated at Northwestern University, Ohio State, and the University of California in San Francisco. He's the author of 4 books on the history of medicine and science, and he's received numerous awards and accolades for his work in research and clinical medicine, as well as scientific history and biography, such as the one we're going to talk about tonight. He is an attending vascular surgeon with the U.S. Veterans Administration. So please help me welcome Dr. Miller.
And I'm very happy to talk about a personal hero of mine, and I think certainly one of the favorite sons of this area. Well, we're going to be talking about Dr. Charles Drew, who's certainly from this area, as you well know, and in fact lived in Arlington for a number of years. So let's get started at the start and discuss why it is that we're going to talk about Dr. Drew today. Dr. Drew was, as you all know, I think, a pioneering African-American surgeon and research scientist in the first half of the previous century. He made extremely important contributions to research in the preservation of blood and blood products in the early years of transfusion. And we'll talk about those in a bit more detail later. He was also, at least as important, he was a leader in administration and scientific backbone of wide-scale blood collection as we know it today. He was also the chair of the Department of Surgery at Howard University and the chief of surgery at the Freedmen's Hospital. In 1989, the Society of Black Academic Surgeons was founded, and they use his visage as their logo. And you'll note that they don't feel the need to actually put the name on there. Everyone knew who they were talking about when they created it. So, beginnings. Charlie Drew, and everyone called him that in childhood and his family throughout his life, was born in 1904 over in Foggy Bottom. He was the eldest of what were eventually 5 Drew children. Here are 4 of them. That's Charlie at the top, the eldest, his brother Joe, and then 2 sisters, Elsie and Nora. There would later be a 3rd sister named Eva, who was born under many years later. She was by far the youngest. Drew attended the Thaddeus Stevens Elementary and then the Dunbar High School, which, as I'm sure you know, was very highly regarded in that period of time, one of the best secondary schools in the country. Most of the teachers there held advanced degrees in the subjects that they taught. Drew himself was a relatively mediocre scholar at Dunbar, although he made the grade. He never flunked out, but he was an extraordinary athlete during those years in multiple sports. He was on the track team, basketball, baseball, and football, and was an all-star in the metropolitan and regional areas in all of the above. The sister Elsie that was in the bottom right of that photograph that I showed you earlier passed away in 1920, and she had always been a little bit on the sickly side, and she may have caught tuberculosis from one of the grandmothers who was known to have it. But that was also at the time of the influenza epidemic, and the 2 of them put together were probably an insurmountable health problem for her. Later on, Drew, and this is from his medical school application in 1928, indicated that it was the death of Elsie that first gave him the idea to become a physician, and really the influenza epidemic as a whole. Now, he matriculated at Amherst, and Dunbar had a bit of a pipeline there. There was a number of students who went to Amherst straight from Dunbar. In fact, 2 of Drew's lifelong friends who were in the class ahead of him at Dunbar were already at Amherst when he got there. That was William Hasty, and then another figure who we'll be talking about momentarily. Between 1922 and 26, Drew was at Amherst, again, a star athlete. I should back up just a bit to talk about the circumstances there again of his matriculation, because it was later on publicized that he had an athletic scholarship there. In fact, I don't believe that that was the case. He himself, on a later scholarship application, indicated that it was an academic scholarship that he got at Amherst. And we have the letter accepting him into college from the dean, and it doesn't mention athletics anywhere in it. So I think that that may be one of those myths. That's not to say that his outstanding performance as an athlete in high school didn't have something to do with his acceptance. And that outstanding performance continued in Massachusetts, where he was the outstanding member of the track and football teams. In fact, made at least one All-American team as he played what was then called end, both offense and defense. And apparently he was, his coach said that he was the best player that he had ever coached. And his coach at Amherst was a fellow called Tuss McClowry, who's in the Football Hall of Fame as a coach. In fact, there's an award that's given every year from the Coaches Association that's called the Tuss McClowry Award. He said that Drew was the best player he ever coached. And in the 1960s, long after Drew had passed away himself, McClowry said that Drew would have been a star at any college in any time period. He did have, as you might imagine, in these eras of leather helmets and so forth, he did have some football injuries, including a significant one to his foot, an ankle that was thought to be serious enough that even there was talk of amputation in the newspapers. I haven't seen any medical records that would indicate that anybody who was taking care of him thought that it was that severe. It was probably just a severe strain, but it's kind of funny we think about sports being so prevalent in our culture now, and football and the game that was on the other day. The newspapers in Amherst were full of headlines that Drew was finished playing football. It was big business back then too. One of his, and that injury and when he was taken to New York City to examine it, x-rays and so forth, was another factor that he later indicated was important in his decision to become a physician. A third factor was a biology teacher who was this gentleman, Otto Glaser, who was a German professor who apparently had great charisma, at least as far as Drew was concerned. This is a transcript of his grades from Amherst, and you'll see they're arranged top to bottom, 22, 23 his freshman year. Grades were not terribly good, also not terribly good the following year, except in physical education, as you might imagine. In 24, 25, this is when he starts in his junior year to encounter Otto Glaser, and especially in his senior year in 25 and 26. And you'll see in the advanced biology classes of Glaser's, including one of which he wrote a long thesis as a senior. He got an A on that, his highest grade in a non-physical education class. Oratorio was vocals, choir essentially. Now, I want to draw your attention. At the top left, you'll see that he took English AB in 1922 and 23. Got to see, but more importantly than that, it was 4 semester hours of credit on Amherst's schedule. It was a year-round class, but it only met once or twice a week. And so it didn't accrue that many credit hours. This was otherwise wouldn't have been anything of importance, but you'll find out later that it actually turned out to be a key thing in Drew's life. So by the time he graduated from Amherst, he had determined that he wanted to become a physician, and the next issue was how to go about doing that. At the very top of the list was finance. He didn't have the money at that time to do what he wanted to do. So what he did was he found a position at what was then Morgan College in Baltimore on the faculty. And he was brought on to teach biology and chemistry and be the athletic director and essentially the coach of all the sports. And he spent 2 years there saving money. He also managed to elevate those Morgan sports teams from doormats to champions. The basketball team, the football team was regular. The scores from the early 20th century are a little bit difficult to track down, but I was able to find some of them, and they were 60-0, 80-0. They lost every one. And by the time he was finished with them, they were crowned the mythical national champions of the African-American schools at that time. There's that football team. So he resigned after 2 years before he'd been accepted into medical school, which was a pretty nervy thing to do. But he clearly had confidence. And he applied in the summer of 1928. One of the places he applied was at Howard University, the hometown university, one of only 2 Black medical schools at the time. The other one was Meharry in Nashville. So when he applied to Howard, he ran into that English issue again, because he did not have enough semester credit hours for Howard to accept him into medical school. Amazing as that is to believe. So he was rejected, even though those credit hours, as he said, that his brother said, would have been at Amherst would have been far superior to what they would have been at Howard. In any event, it meant that that Drew had to look elsewhere for a medical education. We know that he was at least involved with Harvard because there is an existing letter from one of their admissions people. Unfortunately, all it says is that your earlier letter cannot be found, and she is sending a catalog to him and an application, but also points out that it's too late in the year for him to apply for the upcoming class. So he would have to wait for another year. You'll remember he had already resigned from Morgan. So there's a little bit of a bind there. And then we come to probably the biggest remaining unsolved mystery of Dr. Drew's life, as far as I can tell. And that is how he ended up at McGill in Montreal. This book that I'm displaying here, called One Blood by Spency Love, is a terrific book. It's not really a biography of Dr. Drew. It's more a sociologic history of the events that surround his death, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But there are some biographical moments in that. And when Ms. Love got to this section of Drew's life, she had this quote, which was that McGill had a decent record of enrolling Black students and treating them fairly. She didn't make a citation for that, which was unusual because she generally cited most things. And I think she's actually just voicing a conventional wisdom that it turns out really isn't true. When I started researching up at Montreal for this, I was able to identify this letter, which comes from one of the associate deans here, a fellow called J.C. Simpson. This letter is from later on, it's 1938, and it isn't directly related to Drew, although he's mentioned in it. This letter is in response to an individual who's concerned about there being quotas for Jewish students. But Simpson very forthrightly says in this paragraph, for your information, I might add, the only other apparent discrimination against Americans is in respect to the Negro. Because of hospital restrictions, particularly in obstetrics and gynecology, we can take very few Negroes. Feeling that our first duty is towards those of British extraction, we generally refuse the American Negro. Though here again, we occasionally make exceptions, the most notable being Dr. Charles Drew, a graduate of Amherst, an outstanding student, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look through the graduating classes of the McGill Medical School from the 19-teens and 1920s, you do not find very many Blacks, and the ones that you do, just as Simpson indicates here, tend to be from the Jamaica and the other British parts of the United Kingdom in the Caribbean, that is. So as if that weren't enough, there's also a letter that is at Columbia that is from it's actually a letter of recommendation for Drew for something that came later in his life. But you'll see that it states here that after completing his appointment with us, Drew went to Washington. I'm given to understand that Howard University is for colored students. In this connection, I would mention confidentially that Drew had some colored blood in him, but in some parts of this continent, I would opine that he could pass for white. Despite the above, he was entirely persona grata with us, and we had no regrets, though the matter was very fully discussed at the time of his appointment, which was based on his outstanding undergraduate achievements, both academic and in the field of sport. on his being appointed to this institution. So we sort of have an insight into their perceptions of Drew at the time. How he heard about them is still a mystery to me. In the fall of 1928, though, he goes to Montreal and becomes a student there. He for the first 3 years, lived at this address here, 3580 de Rocher. And here's a letter where he's just gotten in and he's telling his father what things are like. The medical course was 5 years for McGill at that time. The first 2 years mirrored what we had in the States and still do, which is a preclinical sciences, as you see here, anatomy, histology, and so forth. And then it was 3 years of clinical sciences at McGill. So that was his course of study. Interestingly, at the time, the Canadians did not distinguish between undergraduate and graduate students with regard to athletics. And so even though Drew was a graduate student in the School of Medicine, he was allowed to compete at an intercollegiate level. He also competed for the College of Medicine in an interscholastic competition between the other schools. And once again was a star, as you see here, right in the middle of the Montreal Gazette. Drew is outstanding for former Amherst College Flash, scores for 4 first places. And then his team, the medicine team, won as a result of that, the interscholastic. He was briefly on the rugby team there, but thought the better of it because it was obviously too dangerous. After his time there, Drew had, at the time that he finished at McGill, he was, in fact, the highest scoring Canadian college athlete in the track and field team. I don't know if that's still the case, but it was then. And he made the captain of the track team. He was also captain of the track team at Amherst, and must be one of the very few times that one individual has been captain of a varsity team in 2 different universities. So, but all was not necessarily happiness, certainly, when he was up there. There's a really remarkable document that in the book I have almost verbatim. It's pretty long, 10 pages, but I couldn't really see a reason to justify not putting it all in there because it's so revelatory about him. I call it, and apologies to Beethoven fans, but I call it the Montreal Testament. Within this, he talks about, it was composed on New Year's Eve, 1929 into 1930. And he talks about a crushing loneliness and poverty, but also by the end of what must have taken him hours to write it, we see that he's going to redouble his efforts and will emerge victorious eventually. So it's a wonderful piece, and I'm glad that it survives because it's the single greatest insight into Dr. Drew's mind. Well, as you might imagine would happen after pouring out his soul into that Montreal Testament, he gets pointed by destiny or what have you towards Rosenwald Fellowship. Julius Rosenwald was a philanthropist, very wealthy gentleman who gave all of literally every penny that he had away in Rosenwald fellowships and building schools, mainly throughout the South, in an attempt to aid African-American education was really what his goal was. And these Rosenwald fellowships, one of which Drew received, were given to scientists, physicians, artists, musicians. Many famous people from the African-American community in the 1930s received Rosenwald fellowships, and one of them was Dr. Drew. And this is his application for that, which was, as we say, accepted. So academically, now, Charles Drew hits another gear entirely, one that we just saw glimpses of at the end of Amherst, and we could tell as a teacher at Morgan, he was starting to come into his own, but he became truly an exceptional medical student while he was at McGill, consistently at the top of his class. Here's a picture of the members of the McGill Medical Society. Drew wrote columns for the McGill Medical Undergraduate Journal, and here he is pictured with of the members there. And Alpha Omega Alpha is the medical scholastic honorary fraternity. He was vice president of it. He also received another scholarship. That was the J. Francis Williams Fellowship, which was a academic competition that he won. Here you see one of his few existing grade cards. And we see they got A2, A5 in surgery, and then B in OBGYN. The number behind the A represents what rank his grade was in class. So if you were A2, that meant you got excellent performance, second best in the class, A5, fifth best, etc. Here's his graduating class, some of them anyway, of 1933. He's toward the top left if you're looking for Charles Drew. And from this newspaper article about the graduating class, we see that he finished with second place aggregate standing in his final year. Interestingly, the first place finisher was a woman named Ruth Dow. You'll note from the photograph there that there were not too many women medical students at McGill either in 1933, but one of them graduated at the top. And here's it from the yearbook with some of his accomplishments. The next year, he spent at the Montreal General Hospital as an intern in surgery. He had decided that softly decided that surgery was the direction that he wanted to go in. So he spent a year there and then a year following that as an internal medicine, sort of hedging his bets. But he always said afterwards that the education as a resident in internal medicine for a year helped him in treating patients as a surgeon in his maturity. So in December 1934, he's applying for the next step in surgical training, which is a true surgical residency. And the difference between internship and residency at that time, and still today, being that operative technique was not really taught in the internship year. It's the basics of patient care. So he hadn't spent any time in the operating room is what it comes down to. And with his performance academically at McGill, he may well have expected appropriately that he would be able to pick and choose what surgical training programs he could go to, and found out to his dismay that that wasn't the case. We know he was rejected by the Mayo Clinic. I don't know of what other programs he may have applied to. And this is the other gentleman along with William Hastie that was in his, it was 1 year ahead of him at Dunbar and at Amherst, and that was W. Montague or Monty Cobb, who was a anatomist and a physical anthropologist at Howard at this time. Since he hadn't gone to done anything like Morgan years, he was a couple of years ahead of Drew on a career path. So he was already on the faculty, and Drew reached out to him asking in this letter here what things were like there and whether he might benefit by doing a surgery residency at Howard. This is what Cobb had to say years later about that. He was highly esteemed in Montreal and had good opportunities, but as he had learned at Amherst, something of the subtler limitations in the US, so he came to sense the invisible lines under the British system. And I think Cobb may have not quite understood exactly what the circumstances in Canada were. This is a letter from Alfred Bazin, who was not the chief of surgery when Drew was at Montreal General, but he was on the faculty. And he had this to say about Drew: "We would have wished him to stay with us longer, but felt it would be unfair to him, as he is quadroon and there would have been no future for him in practice in Montreal." So I think Cobb's estimation of his opportunities is a little bit overstated. Robert Jason was a member of the faculty at Howard, and later a colleague when Drew also became a member, and he had this to say pretty eloquently: "It was in this way Charlie learned that he had what he had only occasion to suspect before. In the competition for a place at the top in his chosen field, merit alone was not enough. In this land of equal opportunity, he found that opportunity for him was not equal." To his good fortune, this person was in charge of the medical school at Howard at the time, and that was Numa Pompilius Garfield Adams. who was himself a graduate of Howard and other institutions, and had a solid, practical, but broad vision for what he thought that the Howard University School of Medicine could be. He had actually been tracing the career of Drew before Drew even thought about going to Howard. We've have some minutes from meetings in the early 1930s where he's already talking about Drew before Drew had any suspicion. In any event, Charles Drew ends up at Howard, and then under the aegis, friendly aegis of Numa Adams. One of the things that Adams had accomplished was to set up Rockefeller Foundation fellowships for his faculty. What his plan was, at that time, the professors of the different medical specialties at Howard were all white physicians from Washington, D.C. area. They would do their private patient care during the day, and then either early in the morning or in the evening, they would round at Howard. And Numa Adams wanted to replace this with individuals who he brought in, who he trained, African Americans, to take over those top slots. And that's why he was thinking about Drew as early as the early 1930s. He had obtained funding via the Rockefeller Foundation for fellowships at other universities for his new faculty members. So his plan when he brought them in, and it wasn't just surgery, it was also in the medicine fields, bring them in, have them train here for a little while, and then have them go out to these prestigious universities, learn the techniques of academic medicine and surgery, and come back and be leaders in the field there. This is the path that led Dr. Drew to Columbia, where he went on one of those fellowships in the late 1930s and encountered this man, the head of surgery there, Alan Whipple, who in our field is, and in general surgery especially, is a legend. There's an operation that he does that still is sort of the ne plus ultra of abdominal operations that he is named for. Also a great researcher, teacher, the full gamut. Whipple met and immediately liked Drew, recognized his talent, but didn't honestly have the courage to put him on the wards. He said, what we'll do is we'll start you off. They've never had a Black resident or a medical student there. So he said, we will start you off in the research lab and see how things go there. And Drew accepted. He said, that's probably the best thing. The lab that Whipple put Drew in was the lab of this man, John Scudder, who was working on the problem of shock. This is obviously a later picture during the war. So Drew goes into the lab, into Scudder's lab, and starts working on shock, and especially transfusion and shock. Now, in order to really understand, because now we're getting into the meat of why Drew is justifiably famous. So shock is a little bit of a difficult thing to discuss even amongst medical people because the word carries so many connotations. But I think a good way to think of it is that in a medical context, shock is an imbalance between oxygen need and oxygen delivery. There are many different types of shock, neurogenic shock, septic shock, different things. Maybe the easiest one to think about conceptually, which happens also to be the one that is most germane to what we're talking about, is what we call hypovolemic shock. Not enough blood. It's actually more complicated than that, but if you think about it as not enough blood, that's a good way to get started. So the concept of transfusion had been around since antiquity, but there were all sorts of problems with it, technical problems with how do you get blood from one person into another. And then once those had been partially solved, not completely certainly, they ran into issues with blood groups, and it turned out that you could kill somebody by giving them someone else's blood. Nobody expected that before. By the time Drew gets involved with it, most of that has been solved. Not all of it, but most of it. In fact, when he was at Columbia, Landsteiner was also there, who's the one who came up with the blood groups, although he was in Europe when he came up with those. So Drew diligently learns everything there is to know about the existing science there. And one of the really fascinating things about the thesis that comes out of all this is he summarizes all of it. So if you could have had that, just Drew's thesis in 1939, you would learn in 20 pages everything that had been done with regards to shock and transfusion at that point. Then he starts to say, here's what I've done to push things forward. One of the things that they do is, and they were not the first to think of this, the blood bank concept had been around, and we know in Russia and some people in Chicago had already been thinking of it. But the issue of transfusion, up to that point, transfusions had always been done patient to patient. It frequently was done in the operating room. You roll in the donor, you roll in the recipient. By whatever means, you access the blood vessels and connect them to, maybe there's an intervening bottle with an anticoagulant in it, something of that nature. Even when they had some understanding of blood groups, frequently there'd be blood reactions, transfusion reactions, which could be fatal. So it was not a small thing to do. And people recognized from the, not from the start, but from middle way through, that it would be very advantageous indeed to have blood available that could be simply given when it was needed rather than having to drag someone in. There was an event at Columbia that Scudder and Whipple were involved in before Drew got there, where one of the physician's wives gave birth and then did not stop bleeding afterwards, and essentially exsanguinated. And there was a massive, immediate sort of emergency blood drive. Everybody give blood so that we can give it to this young mother. And to a certain extent, I think that was one of the things that really drove the Columbia program, was the death of that woman. So this is where Drew, two things that he works on. One is the physiology of storage of blood, and then mechanisms of creating a blood bank so that blood will be available when it's needed. In the midst of all this, he runs into her. That is Minnie Robbins, who he met in Atlanta, where she was an instructor in home economics at Spelman College. I think you can see why he was taken. He was instantly convinced that this was the woman he needed to spend the rest of his life with. He was on his way, this is germane to the end of this story. He was on his way to Tuskegee, to what was called the Andrews Clinic there, which was a free clinic and symposium for physicians. Patients would come free of charge from all through the Southeast down to Tuskegee to this Andrews Clinic. And the physicians, mostly Black, but not all, would come down there, help to deliver care, but also learn all the latest in medical science and treatments. He was on his way there and stopped in Atlanta to visit a friend, and that's where he met her. That was in April. They were married in September of 39. Whirlwind courtship, I think. Shortly after that, in June of 1940, he finishes his thesis here. So he gets a doctorate of medical science. You'll sometimes see online people get confused, and as if he was the first African-American to get an MD from Columbia. This is not an MD. He already had an MD. He got that from, well, they didn't call it MD, actually. It's a different name. But he was already a physician doctorate out of McGill. This is an advanced degree, at roughly equivalent to a PhD. So we want to correct that misnomer when you see it. Now, after finishing that, oh, by the way, Drew's thesis, which I've already extolled the virtues of, was never published. It's still never been published. There are a couple of copies of it around, and some have been put online by the National Library of Medicine, but the original one has never been published. Hopefully somebody will rectify that at some point. That's not to say the information in it was never published, because he did publish, I think, 14 individual papers in scientific peer-reviewed journals that are, in essence, they are the information that's found in his thesis. Well, now he's done at Columbia. He's spent 2 years there. And he returns to Washington to join the faculty as a assistant professor. Essentially, he's fully trained as a surgeon. But New York was not quite done with him. So in the fall of 1940, of course, war has already been afoot in Europe, but things really ramp up when the Blitz takes place. And of course, it had got all kinds of press, as you might imagine. And there were wounded soldiers, one thing, wounded civilians as another one. And a program was developed by some groups in New York City that were already interested in blood transfusion, and this was sort of the right in their wheelhouse. So they developed what was called the Blood for Britain project, which was an idea to canvass the entire New York area and to collect as many blood units and blood products as they could to send them over to help the English. This was when the concept of transfusion of plasma really takes hold. Now, this was the idea of transfusing not whole blood, but just serum or plasma, and we'll talk about that, what those mean in just a second, had been present throughout the 20th century. People had recognized that in shock, even though oxygen delivery is an important thing in the cells, the red cells are the ones that do that. If the volume of the blood is diminished significantly, you can improve the volume of the blood by administering serum or plasma without having to give the cells, and it actually helps shock quite a bit, despite the fact that the actual oxygen-carrying cells aren't in there. The advantage of plasma and serum is that not containing the cells, these substances don't decay as fast. The red cells you could only keep, even under the best circumstances, Drew found, for about 2 weeks. And then the red cells would start to break down and create products like potassium in the containers that would be actually dangerous. But plasma and serum don't do that. Here's the difference between them. If you took a jar of blood and wait long enough or put it in a centrifuge to accelerate the process, the cellular elements like the red cells will all fall down by gravity and end up at the bottom. They'll clot there too. And when that happens, there's a straw-colored fluid above that is serum. If you put an anticoagulant in before that happens, then the coagulation proteins that are in there, which are osmotically active, and so they help to increase the volume when you administer it as a treatment for shock, they're still in there. We still use plasma as a volume expander, but particularly in cases of coagulopathy, when the blood's not clotting very well, if you give plasma that contains the blood, it doesn't contain the cells, but it does contain the clotting proteins. So they settled on plasma because this was still liquid plasma too, by the way. During the war, they converted over to powdered form when they found they could do that. But the plasma was less volume. It could be stored at room temperature for a long time, and it was much more efficacious to do that. And the Blood for Britain project, which probably ought to be the Plasma for Britain project, really showed that, and plasma was what they delivered to the British. The donations were helped by utilizing the Red Cross, who was very good at community relations. That would be of importance because they got interested in the whole idea of being part of this blood transfusion game. So the Blood for Britain project was completed in January of 1941. The reason, which I glossed over there, why Drew was drawn back into it was because as that unfolded in New York, the search was underway for a leader who's going to run this. And they approached Scudder, who had run that laboratory, and he said, "Drew's your guy. He knows everything." And they reached out to Drew down in Washington and said, "Can you come up here? We'll pay you." And they did. He stayed there until the first part of 1941. And here's the complete report of that. That's Scudder's copy, in fact. They ended up getting almost 15,000 donations and generating over 5,000 liters of plasma to send to Britain. As I mentioned, the Red Cross was paying attention to what was going on. So when the Blood for Britain program came to an end. And it only came to an end because the British were doing it themselves by then. Everyone could anticipate that the Americans would be involved in this global war. We didn't know in what capacity, but it was clearly on the horizon. And so the Red Cross decided that they would take this concept of the Blood for Britain and spread it nationwide. And who better to lead it than Charles Drew, who had just shown great success with the previous. Here's an important picture. It's important for a couple of reasons, one of which is that it shows Drew as the head of the Red Cross blood donor program, but it also shows him with that first bloodmobile, which was just a refrigerated car that was a trailer attached to the back of an ambulance. And it was taken around to various schools and factories and things, and people who might otherwise not have given blood because they couldn't take the time to come into the donor sites. Instead, they took the donor sites to them. Interesting aside, Drew was just starting to get the flu, and you can kind of look in his face that he doesn't look all that great. He was about to take, in the midst of all of this, he was about to take the oral part of the American Board of Surgery examination, which I can tell you, having taken it, both as a general surgeon and vascular surgeon, is a bear. The fact that he was running this sick and still took that exam, and not only did he take the exam, he crushed it. He got close to 90% on it. He did so well on the exam, in fact, that they made him an examiner immediately afterwards. The legend goes, and we don't know because I haven't been able, the American Board of Surgery won't tell me. They still won't give up the information from that long ago. But the legend is that one of the questions he was asked on the examination, the way they did it then is different from now. Now you go to a horrible hotel someplace and you sit down and two examiners who are senior surgeons, you as a surgery resident or a finishing fellow will know, start to pepper you with questions, and it's a miserable experience. Same thing then, except they did it at the bedside with an actual patient, and you would have the actual x-rays and the lab report, the chart to examine all of these things. And according to the story, as it happens, they asked Drew about a patient who was suffering from shock. Well, the leading authority in the world was the person they were asking. So now, having completed actually almost another year up in New York, which must have put incredible stress on his marriage. In fact, that stress is reflected. There's some letters between Charles and Lenore in the book. He returns now to Howard, not just as an assistant professor, a member of the faculty. He has now earned the right to be the chairman of surgery and the chief surgeon. Okay. He turns his focus on the what we call the three pillars of academic medicine, which is to care, educate, and discover, as it says at UCSF, one of my alma mater. Take care of patients first, teach second, and research third. And he starts to do all three of those, the first two mainly, because the resources at Howard don't allow him to do too much research, really for the rest of his life, unfortunately. At home, he starts to build a family here, and we see his three daughters. Charles Drew Jr. was coming too. But the whole issue, because he had demonstrated his mastery of the existing science with regard to shock and shock treatment and blood, he was called upon by members of the press to opine on what was the military's policy at the time regarding segregation of blood. And this is what that was. This is how that happened. After Pearl Harbor in December of 41, the Red Cross was already starting their blood gathering, as we mentioned, nationwide, not just in New York. They were now doing it nationwide. And the Black donors would go to the donation stations, patriotic as anyone, but be turned away. They were not allowed to donate blood. And this caused an enormous hue and cry. By January, it had reached the office of the president. This is the following month. So the pushback was gigantic about this. Drew was asked his opinion, and he gave it. No scientific basis for the separation of the bloods of different races. The only cause to separate blood is blood type. That's it, the blood groups. And it's interesting historiographically to look at the blame game that was played at that time. Because the Red Cross said, well, it's not us. It was the military. And the Army said, it's not us, it's the Navy. The Navy didn't say anything. So who was actually behind all this? It sort of reminds me of the concept that we saw in J.C. Simpson's letter, that there's a problem with having an African-American on the OBGYN wards in Montreal. Did anybody ask? Don't know. Did anybody ask? I'll bet it wasn't an issue at all. They found that out in Columbia. I don't have time to do absolutely every detail here, but after Drew's performance in the laboratory for a few months, it was so outstanding that Whipple put him on the wards. And he excelled on the wards. And there was never a whiff, a hint of any problems from any patient, any staff member at all. He integrated absolutely flawlessly, seamlessly with that team. So it comes back to who's asking these questions, or people coming up with answers that they like without asking the questions. What happened after all of that was that the Red Cross and the military relented, and they accepted African-American donors, but they kept the blood separate all the way until 1948, when very quietly in peacetime, they stopped segregating the blood. So in 1944, Drew is awarded the Spingarn Medal, the highest honor of the NAACP. And at that point, he's starting to become more, I don't want to say strident because that's the wrong word, more powerful in his vocal speech regarding these issues. And this is part of his acceptance speech at that time. He's speaking specifically to the blood transfusion issue here, but a great mass of people who have been hurt sorely and unnecessarily by a form of discrimination should never have come about. We must smash this new form as we have the others. Interesting picture there. Does anybody recognize any other figures sitting there with Drew? See Cab Calloway at the far left there? Yep. Yep. This Minnie the Moocher right there. Okay, so in the late 1940s, Drew, about 1945 is the apex of what I would call his political speaking. He starts to back away from that on a national level and focus more on what he can do at Howard. And he's particularly interested in optimizing healthcare for the African American community. And he feels in his position, the best way he can do that is to train the medical students to be the best physicians possible, train the surgeons to be the best surgeons possible. So he focuses on that. It comes right up against, though, he can't escape the problems of prejudice, because he comes right up against the American Medical Association and the American College of Surgeons. The American College of Surgeons, both of these organizations nominally would accept African Americans, but in practice, it rarely ever happened. One of the founding members of the American College of Surgeons was a Black surgeon, but the second one wasn't until the 1930s. And at this time, they were actively not accepting Black members. The AMA is more complex. It's much older. It dates back to the mid-1800s, and would always fall back on the statement that they were just an amalgamation of local medical societies. They had to abide by whatever the local medical society said. So if a medical society in, say, Washington, D.C., which is obviously where he lived, opted not to allow Black members, then the AMA wouldn't do anything about it, even though they were perfectly willing to override local medical associations when it came to other issues. So there's a lot, if you're interested, I hope you are, there's the back and forth between the AMA and the college in letters exists, and it's in the book. Drew's arguments are very persuasive. I can hardly doubt that you believe. And this brings us to, it's sort of a sudden juxtaposition here, but his death was a sudden juxtaposition. Dr. Drew was going back to Tuskegee to the Andrews Clinic in March 31st, 1950, overnight into April 1st. And he was driving there with a carload of Howard physicians to work at the clinic. He was the second driver in the team. He took over around Petersburg, Virginia, and near a place called Haw River, not that far from Winston-Salem. The car turned over, and one of the physicians in the car with him said that Drew had fallen asleep at the wheel, and they hit. I've been at that. I was just mentioning earlier to him, but it's a somewhat sudden turn where that existed. There's a monument to him now. It's now the Charles Drew Highway, but the car flipped over. There were no seat belts at the time, so the other three suffered minor. One had a fractured arm. The others had bumps and bruises, but Drew was caught in the car. He wasn't thrown from it. His foot was underneath the brake pedal, so he was stuck in the car there. But the driver's side door came out, so he flipped. He slid out the side of it, and they were probably going in excess of 50 or 60 miles an hour. And the car rolled over him. He suffered severe injuries, not survivable injuries. So I'll just briefly touch on the fact that the rumors somehow got afoot that he actually did have survivable injuries, but when he got to the local hospital there in Burlington, North Carolina, that he was refused treatment, or there was a even more insidious form of it where he was refused specifically blood transfusion. None of those things are true. The other survivors from the car all said that the physicians, nurses, and adjuvant folks there at that hospital all did their best, but it was not a survivable injury. He had terrible crush wound, open head wound, just not a survivable thing. So that was April 1st, 1950. And we could talk for a long time about what the legacy of Dr. Drew is. It's sort of summarized in that first slide, but his name exists on institutions and places all over the country now. There's Charles Drew University of Medical Sciences out in the West Coast. There's a U.S. Navy ship. There's bridges, innumerable clinics, blood centers, as you might imagine, libraries, schools. And from a distance, I think we need to look back on him with a combination of reverence and awe. Truly great man. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, I'll do my best. Sir.
I don't know if it's a question, but I just realized during your talk, my late father had Charles Drew as a professor at Howard. And I'm racking my brain if I remember any of what he said, and I'll ask my mother, but there's also a picture at home. It's just a class photo where he is with, I think, two other people. As the classes were small, it was probably less than 30. And Drew and a couple of other people were in that photo, but I do remember my father thinking it was a professor.
That's a family memory to cherish. Sorry.
Notice that last slide we had the headline of his death. There's a story there about another black, Jack Robinson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 1950. So he would have already been playing for the Dodgers, I think. It's a little bit early. Well, thanks again for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Let's see if there's any of the Zoom party.
Yeah, one question. Great story, great book, and great presentation. What caused you to write the book? You've written other books. Are they all biographies, or are they other kinds of books? This was tremendous. But
thank you. I've written two other biographies of surgeons. One is called The Big Z, which is the story of a surgeon called Robert Zollinger, who was one of the giants in 20th century surgery. And then the book that I wrote before this was called A Time for All Things, The Life of Michael DeBakey. And it's a exhaustive story of the great cardiovascular surgeon, DeBakey. And my other book is just sort of a memoir of surgery residency. It's called Making of a Surgeon in the 21st Century. And now I'm working on a book about Civil War medicine and surgery. About what caused me to write, even before I started work on the DeBakey book, which is about 2017, people had mentioned to me that Drew was someone who deserved more attention. I got a fellowship to do the DeBakey and didn't really think about it much for the next few years. And then it was sometime during the pandemic, it came back again. People just would mention, why don't you write about Drew? Someone needs to write about Drew. People in my field, in the surgery field. So I reached out to Charlene, who I hoped would be here, his daughter, but apparently she couldn't make it. She's a caregiver for her husband who's been having health issues. But I reached out to her, and we had our first conversation might have been an hour and a half on the telephone. We just connected very well, and then I came here to meet her, and we talked about how we would do this, and then it just kind of snowballed from there.
I've got two other questions. One is kind of general, but let me hit that first, and then there's a specific one. The questioner, Kate, asks, will the presentation be available online? The answer is, this is recorded, and we will have it posted by tomorrow on the YouTube channel for Arlington Historical Society. But then second part of her question is, where is the book available?
Yeah, it's right over there.
But if they're not in the auditorium, where do they get it?
You could always ask your local bookstore. If they don't have it on the shelves, they can order it in for you, or you can certainly get it on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com.
Historical Society website.
I didn't even know that. You can get it from the Arlington Historical Society website, which would be preferable.
There you go. That's a great advertisement. And then a specific one, this is Janet asked, can we discuss a bit the Drew House, his residence in South Arlington?
Yeah.
Yes. I don't have much information on that. There is some that's in the book. The reason why I don't have much information on it, and it exists. The family has a whole booklet about it. It's too bad. Well, hopefully maybe the members of society can get to work on that. The reason why I don't go into much detail about it and don't know that much about it is because they moved there, and I should have mentioned this in the talk. They moved to Arlington shortly after the death of Elsie. And the prevailing thought at the time was that the father he thought that it would be safer for their health to be out of the city, out of the Foggy Bottom neighborhood. And so moved out here. And then I know that the house went through a number of renovations. There are some famous trees associated with it. But I don't go into much detail because as soon as they moved out here, Charles was gone. He went to Amherst almost immediately after that. And then he was in Baltimore, and then he was in Montreal. And when he came back here, he didn't live there. So the family continued to live there, and he would spend his summers there. But it wasn't really his primary place of residence, so I didn't get much detail about it. There was too many sports scores to include. I'm joking.
Great answers. Thank you.
Because I have to defend myself about that. They say never to read any reviews. And the reason, of course, is if you read a bad review, you have to also, and ignore it, you have to also ignore the good reviews, right? So you just don't review any of them. So I'm happy to report that we don't have any bad reviews, but one reviewer, I think, really missed it. So I'm going to say this in anticipation of any of you who haven't read the book. The first section of it is primarily discussing Drew's great performances as an athlete. And the reason why I did that, just mea culpa, I guess, is because that was the dominant thing in his life, for certain. And it informed the person that he became, because he treated the whole rest of his life the way he treated those sporting events, which was I'm going to be the best that there is and nobody's going to stop me. And so if you don't discuss that, I would say to this, to the individual, then you won't understand the mature person that he became. You know, his motto, essentially, he never said that it was his motto, was excellence of performance will overcome artificial limitations placed by man. He used to say that to his residents. He said it to his children. And if you had a motto for Charles Drew, that's what it would be. And that came because of his efforts, work in the athletics of his childhood.